in the garden of the Mighty Hag. "What is the point?" yelled the hag, and she kicked at the table so all the small figures fell over and chaos ensued. "What is the hexing point?" the hag shouted. She turned with frustration and a sweep of her shawl, so that everyone spilled down from table to floor, and a cacophony rose of protesting voices which grew shrill and intense. She bent low and glared at the crowd of tiny women. "Don't fuss," the hag growled. "The table's not high, and that rug is quite soft, and nothing is hurt but your pride. I am enraged by what I have witnessed, which is better, I think, than being hollowed by grief. I have midwifed you, nurtured you, mended you, given you courage and freedom, shown you power and magic, and in return, you had only one task to accomplish. Through neglect or objection, you have failed to fulfill this quite simple requirement, so I ask you again, what is the point?" And the Mighty Hag stamped from her kitchen, slamming the door so fiercely that on the shelf over the fireplace, her ancient clock jolted into action. On the high hill, a large convergence of women were rushing down the bare slopes towards the shelter of a forest as the brooding storm broke above them. They screeched and squealed as they slipped through the mud. Thunder grumbled and cracked, rocks trembled, trees lashed at the wind, and heavy rain drenched the valley. The storm was immense and intense. Then, almost as quickly as it had arrived, the feral weather dispersed. The valley became quiet. The only sound that remained was the rhythmic dripping of water from wet branches onto drowned soil, like the ticking of a great cosmic clock. The women began to stir. They shook the storm from their coats and squeezed water from their hair. They stepped out from the arms of sweet pines and tender willows, watching each other very closely, moving around cautiously, forming tight knots and tangles across the broad glade. They stepped back into the grievances they had been airing before the storm arrived. The forest may have been sweet and tender, but these women were not. They were being spiky and abrasive and headstrong and careless and unkind. There was a grim atmosphere washing over that glade. Unfortunately, it seemed that these sisters had entirely lost the plot. Out in her garden, the hag had been restored to calm. The plants always soothed her. Seedlings nestled into her gnarled hands. Blossoms caressed her weathered old face. Air scented by herbs tousled her white cloud of hair. The quivering green light in the trees wrapped around her like prayer. She felt sorry now for those tiny women with their tight knots and tangles, but there was nothing to be done to assist them. They had to work this one out for themselves. The Mighty Hag shrugged philosophically and sat down in her sun-warmed chair for a nap. In the glade, things were not quite so peaceful. The women were glowering, some were huffing, a few were even jostling. It was all very far from how they had begun. In the early days, their passion and enthusiasm were productive and purposeful. Their delight in each other and in what they were creating was unbound. Gratitude made them generous, and joy made them kind. They found power and naturally understood how to hold it lightly, passing it between each other with ease, so that the power grew, and there was plenty to share with everyone. Most importantly, they did not take themselves too seriously. They remembered how to have a good laugh. Who knows when this stopped? There was certainly no laughing now, here in this glade. The glowering and the jostling were becoming more accentuated. Tensions were flying like arrows between them. Now the lines of knotted women were slowly surging back and forth across the clearing together, apparently locked into a pushing, pulling dance, as if driven by a wild, pulsing breeze. The Mighty Hag snored robustly in her chair, warmed by the afternoon sun and wrapped in the quivering green prayer. She was dreaming, and in her dream she went seeking the tiny, tight women. She found them in a forest and stood silently inside dense pine shadows to watch. She was by now no longer invested in any particular outcome from this disappointing development, but curious to see what might transpire. Although they were but one batch of souls out of so many, she cared about these women. The evening was chill, and the dream hag tucked the quivering green light more snugly around her. She leaned her head close to the damp earth and listened. The ebb and flow of angry, upset women had got a little out of hand. Waves of furious and distraught faces undulated in loops across the clearing. Some women were holding on to each other, making walls of impenetrable righteousness that others were unable to duck around, so shouting inevitably began. Others were wading through the crowd, desperate to extricate themselves from the mess of emotions, crawling past legs towards the edge of the glade, getting trodden on in the process. Somewhere in the midst of this turmoil, the women had lost hold of the reason why they were so upset with each other. It had fluttered like paper to the ground and been trampled by their boots. But no one seemed to care. The tussle set in motion by their uncompromising differences and obvious incompatibilities and conflicting opinions had found its own momentum, and they had embarked on a painful path from which there was no simple return. Or so they believed. Through the forest, the wind picked up again, stirring the sweet pines and tender willows. The Mighty Hag leaned her head against a tree and sighed deeply. She'd seen it all before, of course. The waste of energy, the squandering of goodwill, the misunderstanding about the nature of power, the reckless spilling of too many words, the abandonment of perspective, the unnecessary breaking of respect and potential and spirit. She sighed again and then turned to go back to herself in the garden. She was tired. She was very old, and her resources were fewer than they had been. She had nothing left to spare for these tiny, tight women. They would have to make it on their own. She was cold now as well. The warmth of her chair was not reaching through to the shade of these pines. She slung the quivering prayer of green light more firmly around her shoulders. As she did so, the end of it caught on a twig. She tugged it free and walked away. She did not notice a little piece of green prayer had torn off and remained pinned to the tree. The wind scudded through the glade, but was barely noticed by the cacophony of women. It found the fragment of quivering green light and teased it from the twig. The wind tossed it high over the clearing, danced with it there for a while, then grew distracted and rushed off to seek new delights. The piece of green prayer fell, spinning very slowly, very gently, very delicately, down into the grim atmosphere, down for the bickering crowd, down to rest on the floor of the glade. Its impact was subtle at first. Long, slender tendrils reached out to anchor into the earth. Light moved like mist, seeping over the ground, embracing each rock and tree root it encountered, attaching to bark and rising gradually up towards branches. Steadily, the quivering green prayer expanded and unfurled through the glade. It was creating a vessel, perhaps a womb or a temple, of verdant, plant-hued, foliate-patterned light. For a while, the tussling women did not notice. Being filled by distraction, they had no room to spare for delight. But as their mouths began to fill with this quivering prayer, they stopped shouting and became quiet. And as their bodies were wrapped inside this shivering translucence, they ceased their agitation and became still. They watched each other closely, but now it was with honest curiosity and care. They dismantled their walls of righteous opinion and dissolved their determination to abandon the gathering. Change arrived quickly as they reached the understanding that nothing mattered more in the glade than this quivering green prayer. It was all they needed. It was all they had left. It was everything they had been longing for since those bright early days of passion and enthusiasm and gratitude and joy. Then, incredulously, remarkably, magnificently, they suddenly remembered how to have a good laugh. The Mighty Hag was back in her garden chair, emerging from her doze. The warmth of the evening eased her ancient bones. The abundance of the summer poured strength into her primordial soul. 2 butterflies spiraled fast around her head and caused her to laugh. Her mood was much lifted, although, if truth be told, she was still fretting about those tiny women in the forest. The one task she had given them had not been onerous, although it was both simple in its essence and complex in its potential. She had placed one word in their hands and asked them to look after it. A single precious word to nourish, nurture and protect, to learn from and be inspired by. One cherished word to wrap with honesty, loyalty and trust, to burnish with their clarity and hone with their love. One treasured word to bind into their own lives and share freely with others. A word that could become a mirror in which to discover reliable truth and a lens through which to find wise insight. One word: sisterhood. And the women in the forest had allowed it to slip out of their hands. It had indeed fluttered like paper to the ground and been trampled by their boots. No one seemed to care. They had not even noticed when sisterhood had left them. The Mighty Hag shook this sadness from her head and stood to go inside. The quivering green prayer remained in the garden, where it continued to pulse with urgent and exquisite life. Meanwhile, the women in the forest had been shaken from their turmoil and fury and grief. They were being released by their laughter, and each wave of hilarity brought further relief. Their knots and tangles had unraveled into a web of supporting arms as the sisters held on gently to each other, faces glistening with wonder at how quickly curses had transmuted into kindness. The clearing was flooded with quivering green. The strange light was winding through their hair and seeping into their skin. It felt as if the midwife of life herself had entered their souls and brought them back to their source. It was like waking into a beautiful garden that no one knew existed, like being cradled within the lap of a great universal grandmother who they hardly dared to believe was real. And in the midst of all this, the women saw the seeds and buds and fruits of their sisterhood, and they were ready now to cultivate them with constancy and tend them with love. They laughed, because this realization seemed unbelievably wonderful. The hag was in her kitchen, being surprised. This was an extremely rare occurrence, since her intuitive foresight was generally spot on. All over the rug and spreading across the flagstones, there were wide circles of tiny women dancing. They seemed to be kicking their legs in the air and spinning each other around. The room was filling up with high chirping tones like a dawn chorus of small birds bursting with excitement and happiness. The Mighty Hag peered closer. Yes, her first impression was correct. Sisterhood was definitely taking place all over her kitchen floor. "Well," she said to the jubilant crowd, "I wasn't expecting this." And she smiled so broadly that the tiny women stretched out their arms to receive the warmth of the returning sun.